I think for any string player, or any musician, but especially a string player, chamber music is really the basis, or the thing that has most criteria of music in common, because when you play with orchestra, the ideal would be to have a feeling of chamber music when you're playing with the orchestra, at least in terms of the communication with the musicians on stage. Of course, there are differences in sound projections and so on when you play with a large group behind you and you have to project over them. But the whole process of listening, reacting, instigating through playing, or instigating also through movements or maybe certain eye contact or something, is exactly the same in a concerto as it would be in chamber music. And even aspects of sound production, you can learn a lot in chamber music, especially as a cellist, because when you play in a piano trio especially, you actually have to make a lot of sound to come through a lot of the time. We used to joke, I had a piano trio for a long time, that the goal of the cellist is to always play as loud as possible. It is actually true that the amount of sound that I've had to make in trios is often more than in concertos, even though the venues are usually smaller. Coming against a violinist playing at full volume and a piano right behind you, it really teaches you to project. So it's not only about taking back and listening and being aware, but at the same time about being out and matching your sound to someone else and coming up to the level of other people's sound. So I think chamber music is the best school for performance in general. It's very difficult to develop a sensitivity to what your sound is like in the distance. So I think when you're starting out and you don't have that much experience in different halls, it's always good to have someone listen, or even if there's 3 or 4 of you, for one of the group to go out and listen to the balance between 2 strings or 1 string instrument and the piano, and just to listen to the way it sounds in the distance, and then to react to that when you go back on stage. So you're playing the hall as opposed to playing the instrument. I mean, that's something that I will tell students, that when you go into a hall, take a few minutes and you just feel like that's your instrument, that's the body that you create sound in, rather than the instrument that's in between your hands. And it informs everything you do, in not only sound production, but even timing and so on. Yes. So I try to encourage students to get into halls when they can. Like if maybe the hall at their college is available for half an hour at some point, just go in and play in the big space and feel what it does to your contact with the instrument. Because if you spend 99% of the time in a small room and then someone just puts you on the stage, you can't be expected to know how to deal with that. And it really has nothing to do with playing louder. It's like playing a much bigger instrument where everything takes more time, and reacting to the sound in the distance as opposed to the sound under the ear. And it's just experience that does it. I think the first time I played with orchestra, I played Tchaikovsky, Pezzo Capriccioso, in Prague at the Rudolfinum, and I was 15. So quite late, actually, because a lot of my colleagues had been playing with orchestra since they were maybe 11, 12, and I had learned a couple of concertos by then, or maybe 5 or 6 or something, but I'd never played them with orchestra. And no matter how well I knew the score and how well I knew what the orchestra sounds like from recordings and having gone to concerts and stuff, once I was sitting there and the sound was coming around me, it was such a shock. Luckily, we had a bit more rehearsal time than professional soloists would, because it was a sort of thing for young musicians. So I had a bit of time to get used to it. But it's so different, the timing, the feeling of timing when musicians, some are very close to you and winds are so far behind, and to learn that you do have freedom of rubato with orchestra, but how to do that, how to anticipate the delay that certain instruments will indeed require in the orchestra, or how to learn what signals you give when you play. That if you there's a lot of waiting for each other, I think, when you first start, because the conductor thinks you're waiting because you want to, but you're only waiting for him. All those things, they take experience to learn, and that's for me, that was one of the hardest things growing up as a musician, because it's a bit chicken and egg, because if you haven't done it, then you don't know how to do it. But if you don't do it well, then you're not going to get the opportunities to do it. So that's a very tough period, I think, for young aspiring musicians, because the presenters want you to immediately get it right, but you can't unless you've tried it. So there's a sort of a trial and error phase there. And of course, I'm still learning about that whole phenomenon of communicating with a big group and with a conductor that you maybe just met the day before. But yeah, if any musician that hasn't experienced playing with orchestra and is a bit thrown by it, don't worry, that's completely normal, and it's not going to feel comfortable for a while, but it just gets easier with experience. Well, I'm now, for the first time, at an age where sometimes conductors are younger than me, or they're my age. So we really see eye to eye in terms of, I suppose, in terms of who decides things. There is no more this feeling of the young aspiring soloist and the big mighty conductor who decides or who explains to the young soloist how things should be done. That, I think, inevitably is going to be a part of a young soloist. And I think also conductors spend a lot of time having to accompany soloists that they don't really agree with. And then when they get the chance of someone young, they feel like they can finally do it the way they've always wanted to. And not everybody. I mean, I've had lots of conductors when I was starting out that were very supportive and that were very curious to hear how I was doing things and trying to understand and happy to try something new. But again, just a warning, if it does happen that a conductor tries to mold you into his interpretation, there's only so far you can hold against that. You can't play against each other. So try to embrace it and try to learn from it, because maybe they do have something really valuable to offer, because they will have done the piece for a long time and many, many times. And it's a negotiation. It's a negotiation, and try to limit the amount of things you say to a conductor. With every season, I'm saying less and less to conductors, and just waiting for things to sort themselves out through rehearsal, through the process. Because every time you say, "Oh, I want this, and can you do that?" It can make things more complicated than necessary, and then they can take that too far, and then you have to take it back. And unless there's something, maybe one or two things in a piece that need to be said, I think more or less everything else can be communicated musically in the process. I think when you're young and you're learning standard works for the first time, it's almost impossible not to be influenced by recordings or colleagues. And something that I remember doing when I would listen to other people play standards before I had played them was, "Oh, when I play it, I'm going to do it like that. I'm going to not do that and do it like that instead." And it takes a while to distance yourself from other people's recordings and other people's interpretations altogether, and not try to do things differently. And at the same time, in other cases, not try to emulate what your heroes did, because neither of them are really genuine. I think that the fastest way to finding a genuine and a subjective approach to interpretation is to ask yourself why things are written the way they are. And I think that it's a tough process to ask yourself that, but it will lead you to the simplest and clearest answers to how you want things done, because the more directly you deal with the creative aspect of the composition, the more inevitably you'll bring yourself into it without imposing yourself on top of it. So because classical music needs interpretation, we are always, it lives only through the interpretation. So our whole personality is inevitably always going to be a part of the piece. But that's quite different from making the piece yours or putting yourself on top of the piece. So whenever, especially in key moments, key phrases, melodies, climaxes, turning points, if you ask yourself, why this register, why this instrumentation, why this phrase length as opposed to something else? If I were a composer, why am I choosing to do that? Then you bypass this trying to do it your way thing, because everybody tells you, do your own thing and be yourself, but it's not something you can consciously do. You can't be yourself consciously because you don't know what that is. Only other people can tell you what you are. So in order to take yourself out of the equation in a way is to try and become the composer rather than become the player. And that way, it's actually in that way that you will most simply and most clearly be yourself.